Well, here we are back again, and we're going to show you the part two. We'll show you part one to put it into context of the bloody past of a tiny town. So these people who are new to the town, for that matter, some who are older in the town but don't know much of its past, can get a feel for where they live. So here we go with the bloody past of a tiny town. Lovely scene, isn't it? Beautiful green grass, blackberry bushes surrounding the lawn. Peaceful.
The chaps, gliding a bowling ball across the cropped turf. Couldn't be more pleasant. But this bowling green was originally the tilting ground for the castle. A bit like the local football club, Norman knights turned up regularly to practice cutting off ears, piercing armour with pike or sword. Or even more dramatically, they charged at one another with pointed lances, determined to knock an opponent to the ground, ready to perform the coup de grace, that last fatal plunge of the sword in the unguarded bit of flesh, the throat.
Makes me feel quite faint. But the Knights of 1100 had to be honed to military perfection.
Not only was there the odd disgruntled Saxon around, but even his own side could give the king a rough time. And indeed they did. But before we go to another bloody incident on the Lewes High Street, let's stay with the tilting ground for a moment. In the 1700s, the soldiers, who had wielded their swords with such skill, discovered guns and started shooting one another. That more or less ended the fun of charging at one another with horses. And so this bit of real estate was up for grabs, and the local crown bowlers seized the opportunity in 1751 and turned tilting into bowling.
But this is Lewes, remember. Nothing is ever what it seems.
The horses had ploughed up the ground a bit, so the surface wasn't even. You can see the bumps and ridges across the green. So the type of bowls played on this green was different to any played through the British Isles. And 500 years later, it still is.
It goes way back to medieval times, but so far as we're concerned here, we've been playing here since 1753, and there is some evidence to suggest that in the mid-1600s there was bowls played here. And we're reputed to be the oldest society, sporting society in the world. Very unique, and we're unique in many respects. I mean, firstly, the woods are unique in that most of them over 100 years old. They're lignum vitae, which is very, very hard wood, and that's the reason, of course, they've survived as long as they have. The jack is biased, which is very unusual, and the green is undulating, very undulating. There's not another green anywhere in this country so far as we know, and it makes for a very fascinating but unique game, one that we can't play any other club because there aren't any that play like this. We have a membership of 50 only or 55 now, because that's all the woods we have. They're handed down from person to person. We have a championship game in the summer because we have a competition throughout the year, which is within the club. And I think the winner of that is not only our own champion, but we can consider he's world champion. As long as we can retain the green, and I think we can retain the green, as long as we can do that, there's no reason why this society shouldn't continue ad infinitum almost. It's a great Lewes establishment.
So bowling in Lewes is completely unique. And very difficult. But back to blood and guts. In the last episode, I spoke of a battle between the king and some of his barons. The king, Henry III, held the castle. Now, as you can see, the castle pokes up into the sky quite a bit. The Motter is a man-made hill. And as you can see, a few hours of overtime were put in to build this pile of dirt. From the top, you can see in every direction for miles. Almost impossible to creep up without being noticed. And there was a moat to cross as well. But it's called Castle Ditch Lane, the name reflecting its purpose all those years ago. The king, rather unsportingly, had more men on his side than the barons. But it seems he fell asleep at the switch, and on that meadow over there, Simon de Montfort drew up his troops and joined battle. Fighting was fierce. After all, they'd all been on their own tilting greens, preparing for such a showdown as this. The battle was short and sharp, and the barons put the royal troops to flight. And they showed no mercy. The priory had been used as a staging post by the king's men, and they now took refuge there. It's little wonder that tilting grounds became bowling greens, because despite all that training, the king's men panicked. Screams of terror from both monks and soldiers echoed around the priory. As burning arrows thudded into thatched roofs, setting the priory buildings afire, fighting spilled over to here, our beloved but bloody High Street. Soldiers were either massacred or crushed to death as they tried to get across the bridge over the River Ouse. For the king, it was a complete disaster.
De Montfort, he split his armies up on the hills behind us in the Chalk Downs. He split his army into three forward not flanks, but bunches of men, groups. And they would have been around 1,500 people in them. So a lot of people. So he had 1,500 people. Then he kept men back for himself. So his left flank went off to Barkham and met Prince Edward, and they went off to Barkham. Prince Edward, being a hothead and chasing them all the way out to Barkham, away from the town, was one of the reasons the king's men lost. Because and they were mounted knights. And then the other two sets came into the town and were met by the king's army and Richard of Alameyn's army on sort of the hills around us, really, because where we are now would have been outside the town.
And it was a pretty bloody war.
It was dreadful. It was absolutely dreadful. It's hard to imagine. Lewes is a little place, and on the hills around Lewes, where most of the fighting was, there were tens of thousands of people trying to kill each other. and it was hand-to-hand close combat. And you didn't often die of wounds on the battlefield immediately. You were usually whacked with a broadsword and you would die of internal bleeding, or you would, have limbs severed and die slow death, or you would die death from infection, etc.
So there you go. Not quite one man, one vote, but some slight recognition that the divine right of kings isn't exactly what the Almighty had in mind.
A spark of democracy was ignited, and it happened in Lewes.
As usual, this is thirsty work, and I need to take a break. In fact, have a tipple, or perhaps go to the loos. Don't leave me, there's more blood and gore to come. Oh, Lewes, what a place!
Lewes increased in importance as the Norman occupation took hold. Not that it wasn't important before that. In Saxon times, the town had 2 mints.
And in case my pronunciation confuses you,
Those are places where coins were made, not a sweet that is eaten to try to disguise what you've been drinking. The now much larger cathedral town of Chichester only had 1 mint, which not only indicated the importance of Lewes, but started a sort of battle of popularity between the two places. The struggle for the rights to hold assizes, for example, created a tug of war that saw Chichester hold trials for a while, only for Lewes to get them back. Lewes won. The Crown Court and Lewes Assizes are still located in the modern town, and they ain't going nowhere. Mighty though the Norman castle was, it was dwarfed by the Cluniac Priory, just across this small valley. William de Warenne, who actually fought at the Battle of Hastings, was granted Lewes, along with lots of other goodies, as the spoils of war. His wife Gundrada, a religious lady, asked for and got a sponsorship to establish the priory, just 20 years after England was conquered. Henry VIII's chief vandal, Thomas Cromwell, pulled it down in 1547. Doing the bidding of the king who had fallen out with Rome over his love life. But the workmen of the 11th century were first-class masons, and some of these buildings have lasted to this day. Look at that, almost 1,000 years old. It wasn't just Henry and Thomas who were vandals. The good burghers of Lewes did their part over successive centuries, digging up the grounds and using the stones to build their garden sheds. By the time it was destroyed, the priory dominated the Lewes skyline. Its great church was immense, and the whole complex had its own hospital, dormitories, dining hall, and a wharf. Boats sailed up to the priory to carry and fetch goods.
how times change. This river, the Winterbourne, carried ships and barges up to the docks in the priory. Nowadays, it would barely carry a paper boat.
The priory was vitally important to the local economy, bringing in goods and attracting important visitors.
The ship would have actually come very near to the edge of where the tennis courts are. That's where, because you've got the Cockshoot river or stream which fed into the Ouse, and then yes, there would have been a wharf here from which they unloaded all the stones that they used to build the priory. Because what we see now is a lot of the infill. It's like the cavity walling of the priory. The outside, the dress stone, which is now used in places like Southover Grange, came from Carr on the Isle of Wight or from Caen, so it all had to be imported. It was a significant part of the town. It started small with only 4 monks, but over the course of about 400 or 500 years, the numbers swelled. The maximum number we had was probably about 100 monks. But the church, the big church that was built in the 14th century, was bigger than Chichester Cathedral. It was massive. It would have dominated the skyline in Lewes, so it was incredibly important. And it looked both ways. It looked inland because Lewes was the mother priory for other Cluniac monasteries in the UK, and it also looked towards Europe with its mother house in Cluny. We do a lot of education work with a whole range from tiny children up to adults to get them interested in different aspects of the priory. And the trustees of Lewes Priory Trust are very keen that it's always open and free access. And it's a beautiful place that everybody can come to. They can learn about the history, they can sit in our herb garden and contemplate. And we've just started a new kitchen garden which will grow vegetables. And again, this is for the community to get involved in. So it's very much based in the community of Lewes.
But there's nothing like a bit of competition to stir the blood of a true Lewesian. And sometime in the 15th century, a big fight is recorded between the bailiffs of the town and the prior's men in a local tavern. One of the 63 pubs that once existed in the town, no doubt. The town was walled in 1275, and a fat lot of good it did. When de Montfort's troops attacked, they swept into the town with no trouble. That then caused the town's nobility to strengthen them. They remained intact from then for some centuries, when they came down to the hammers of developers as the town grew. Entry to the town was by 3 gates, north, south and west, each now remembered through the name and a few remaining stones where the wall had been. The walls may have gone, and most of the priory. But many buildings in Lewes have stood the test of time and the vandalism of kings. This church was originally a hospice attached to the priory, and this was an early hospital from the same period. And Cromwell wasn't daft enough to pull down a Tudor manor which Henry had given as part of a divorce settlement. He kept Anne of Cleves House for himself. Within the town walls, this building has more than stood the test of time. St Michael's was the original castle church, built about 1240. It's the parish church of the town and holds both church services and musical concerts today. There is a helmet and depiction of Sir Patrick Hamilton on one of the walls. Lewes is close to the coast and open to attack from French marauders, who regularly attacked the coast. On one occasion in the 16th century, ships sailed up the Ouse far enough for them to be spotted from inside the town. This noble knight depicted here was renowned for his courage in seeing them off. Later, revolutionary Tom Paine was married here before decamping to the Americas. And its spiral tower is one of the few surviving in the UK. Before we disappear into the folds of one of Lewes's hostelries, there's one more legacy from Henry's break with Rome. His successor Queen Mary wanted to restore the Roman Church to England, and she was very vicious towards dissenters. 17 people who refused to give up their beliefs or had read the Bible in English were seized and thrown into a dungeon in Lewes. In November 1545, they were marched up these stairs out to a stake and put in tar barrels. Burning to death in that way was a very horrible way to die. One more chapter in the bloody Lewes High Street saga. This act of savagery has not been lost in the mists of time, however. The 17 martyrs, as they're known, are remembered on November the 5th in the biggest bonfire ceremonies of any Guy Fawkes night in the world. 7 bonfire societies stage a joint procession through the town, torches blazing, effigies of Guy Fawkes and of so-called enemies of bonfire, those who have behaved badly in the year, pulled on carriages stuffed with fireworks. It's a colourful and impressive procession, but with an underlying commemoration of the 17 dead. The parade stops at the town's war memorial for the laying of wreaths to the fallen. Prayers are said. Banners extolling the names of the martyrs are held high. And rousers, or better known to us as bangers, are freely thrown around as the people march. It's a colourful parade.
And I feel underdressed, with just one of my hats to show off. But bonfire, as it's known locally, is not the only memory of Bloody Lewis.
It suffered a far worse fate from a hidden foe. The Black Death.
On Bloody Red to Deadly Black. Next episode, how rats destroyed a major port and brought more historical carnage to Lewis. Until then, a bloody goodbye. Poor old Lewis. I need a drink.
Splendid.
Right.
Because I know damn well what would happen if I tried. I'd lose everything. The screen would go blank, and then I'd have a phone call from someone saying, "John, hello, John, are you supposed?" There it is.
Yeah, it
John
is, yes.
Henty.
And in fact, those first few words were blanked out. But nonetheless, here we are now. John Henty, and I always say he's a legend in his own time.
Well, I am.
And
Yes,
indeed you are, yes.
yes, you could say that. A pretty gory story, I think, is another way of looking at it. Yes, delighted to be here. Lovely day. I see we're both wearing scarves, which says something about us, I suppose.
Yeah, I suppose it does. As a matter of fact, I remember the very first time I ever met you, which was in the lanes in Brighton, and you had a great big long scarf.
Yes,
Do you
yes.
remember that?
I
A
do.
colourful one.
I
Yes,
do. I've
yes.
got a wonderful wife called Sylvia, who, amongst so many things, loves knitting. So, it's just a question of how long a scarf do you need? And sometimes they go on forever, and I've got several. And certainly I knitted one, or Sylvia knitted one, for the fellow who was associated with a magazine in the town called Viva Lewis, Alex. And he's a Rook supporter, which is the local football team, of course. And so he was knitted a lovely black and red scarf by Sylvia, and still wears it, by the way.
Ah, wonderful. Now, I met you because I wasn't long back from Canada, and I got to know and meet another great character, now gone to the clouds, Peter Carver.
Yes, another mate of mine, of course. Good days, good journalists. Peter worked for British Telecom for a while. I was associated with them with a little program I produced for them, which was aimed at hospital radio throughout the country, which was very popular and ran for a good 9 years or so, entertaining every week. It was only half an hour. It was on audio cassette. Remember audio cassette?
Just about.
Well, you see, that's the trouble, you see. And even CDs today, people say, oh, no, I haven't got a CD player, I'm afraid, which is worrying. So welcome the screen. No arguments with that. But they were happy days. Peter Carver, BT, you, the radio, of course, the lovely Rocket Radio here.
As it started off as Radio K-Burn.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I do remember it well. One thing I need to say, which worries me this morning, I know you always have a review of the papers, and I had a quick scan through a paper that we take sometimes, The Independent, and I saw from this man, now what's his name? Have you ever met Piers Morgan?
Piers Morgan.
Oh.
I haven't met him actually, but who is not aware of him?
Well, that's perfectly true. So we can't, and he's local, of course. He's up the road in Newark, for those who know this area. But he said in this little article, daytime TV is full of savages. Now, what's your comment on that? Because I think that's rather Piers Morgan, slightly OTT. Let us just see what he does say. He said, I think that anyone else who thinks that daytime is full of smiley, nice, happy, clappy people, I think they're beginning to realize it's infested by savages now.
Well, if I may say so, I think that we are infested by savages. My theme tune almost is, I start off by saying we've got 650 MPs in Westminster, and I wouldn't give you tuppence for any of them.
Politics?
Hardly polite.
Forget politics. If you want politics, go next door. There's an element of truth. The other thing is, of course, he's going on about this fellow Schofield, you see, this young man.
Oh,
Schofield.
yes.
Well, I wondered whether you might be offering him a job maybe later.
Certainly not.
So,
he's nowhere near savage enough.
I love it. But there we are. It's a sad situation. And above all else, what really bothers me, and perhaps a bit of a theme, if we can have a chat about it, is this whole thing about celebrity.
Yeah.
Dear Lord, what do we mean by celebrities? Think of the celebrities you've met. And I'm going to talk at some time when we have chats about some of the celebrities. And they were celebrities. Today, they just make celebrities and then shove them on Bake Off and all these other random programs.
Yes.
It's very depressing. They're not celebrities.
No. The other thing that really bothers me is that, the BBC cries poverty. It's true of other outfits too, but what you notice is that the same person does a cooking show, a politics show,
Yes.
a running down the street show, and so on, and all because they've got one fee and they have to use them as much as they can, and a square pegs in round holes, and it hardly helps with the quality of programs.
Couldn't agree with you more. And I think more and more evident, particularly with the BBC, you mustn't just knock the BBC, but in the main, I'd say that was absolutely true. Yeah. And having worked for the BBC, of course, I have my own axe to grind, as you know, about local radio.
Yeah.
Because the current issue at the moment is that local radio is going to be cut back and back and back. Goodbye some of the presenters. I'm told that some of them are having to reapply for their jobs and given 60 seconds to do it. I mean, that is unreasonable. And the campaign is going on at the moment, and I fully support that campaign. Local radio should be local, rather like you're able to serve this town, but at the same time, you're able to expand so that others can.
Yes, one of the themes of this program is that we are local. But for instance, just as an example, if we do a rose growing program, is we show it in a local garden with a local person.
Yeah.
But the theme is good enough so that somebody in New Zealand
Yes.
would watch it and say,
Yes.
what an interesting program.
Absolutely right. In other words, don't be narrow-minded. It's a wide world,
That's right, yeah.
and you've got to, or www wide world, basically. Isn't it? That's exactly what it is, and therefore you should embrace. At the same time, though, you shouldn't ignore what's going on your own patch.
No, exactly. I mean, that's where you get your experience from, isn't it?
Yes,
So
it is.
on.
And this
Yes.
town, a lot of things, good
Oh.
and bad, go on as you reflect all the time. I mean, we've just seen that wonderful tribute to Bonfire and the history of the town. And that's only the start of it, as we both know.
It just occurred to me, though, having criticised the BBC for using presenters for all sorts of things, there are only two people in this world that I know that could do that, and you're looking at them.
Well, we are in a privileged position, I suppose you could say that, and we shouldn't abuse that privilege, which I don't think we are or would do. But at the same time, we're entitled to express our opinions.
Yeah.
As long as they are relatively balanced. And I think that is the criteria for any journalist.
Absolutely.
And thank goodness we do regard ourselves very much as journalists with various track records. And going back to celebrity, the sort of people that over the years as a journalist you've met and I've been able to. And I've got one example just to kick it off today, which might amuse you. Would you like to hear about it?
Yes.
It's a good one because I was, and I think there may be people out there, certainly in America, this will ring a bell. We're talking about Warner Brother cartoons. Bugs Bunny,
Yes.
Tweety Pie, the Roadrunner, the wonderful Mimi,
Yes.
and of course, yes, Tom and Jerry, absolutely. Warner Brothers, wonderful.
Roadrunner.
And when I was in London, I used to go to used to be cinemas that only showed cartoon and news. Remember that?
Yes.
And there was one by Piccadilly Circus, and I worked in Lower Regent Street, and I'd pop round there at lunchtimes with some sandwiches, and I'd watch a whole run of and sometimes even stay on for a second time. And I loved Warner Brothers to such an extent that I thought, what I love were the voices, because I love voices. So I wrote to Warner Brothers in Hollywood, as one does. And I said, I'm a great fan of Warner Brothers and particularly Tweety Pie. I love Tweety Pie and Sylvester. I said, it would be great to meet Mel Blanc. Heaven knows what I meant. I mean, how do you do that? It's about 11,000 miles journey. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I had a letter back from Warner Brothers, seriously. And they said a typical studio reply, John, if you're over here on the West Coast, just drop in, And I thought what they didn't know was I was working for an airline. And it was a European airline, but it also had links with America, British Airways or BOAC as it was. So I got in touch with some chums at BOAC and said, look, I'd like to learn more about local radio on the West Coast, which would be of value to me as a journalist here. Could you organise a trip? Eventually, and it took a lot of persuasion, they said, okay, and off I went to the West Coast, to San Francisco, then down the coast to Los Angeles, and I was in the BOAC office in Los Angeles, and I rang the phone number at Warner Brothers, and I got onto Warner Brothers, and they must have been really shocked, but because I said, oh, hello, you may remember my letter. You invited me to meet Mel Blanc. Well, I'm here. You're here? Where, John? I'm downtown in LA. So they said, well, he's freelance now. So here's his phone number. They gave me his phone number. The end of the story is I rang up the number. I don't think Mel Blanc, the voice, answered the phone, but his son did, who was looking after him. He'd had a very nasty car smash, Mel Blanc. And he just invited me up there. I got on a bus and drove out to Hollywood and Vine, up about 18 flights. And there was Mel Blanc. And we had a little chat. He did all his voices. He did all the, yeah, what's up, Doc? And above all else, he encouraged me from that stage onwards to be a great lover of Warner Brothers. And I brought this, I just thought I'd show this to you, or show this to everybody.
Oh, there is Tweety Pie.
There's Tweety Pie. Tweety is, the trouble is, Tweety Pie is rather shy, I'm afraid. So I very rarely now get any tweets out of him, which is rather sad.
Yes.
I mean, everybody's doing Twitter, but this one was doing Twitter before it was even invented.
Yes.
And what was the song now? Oh, here was the song. Look, it's called I tore a
Puddy cat a peeping out on me.
I did, I tore a puddy cat as plain as he could be. I am the great big puddy cat, Sylvester is my name. And there we are. Do you like that, then? So there we are.
Lovely.
He was a lovely man.
Yes.
I tell you what, he was a celebrity.
Yeah.
I mean, he did all the Warner Brothers cartoons. He used to appear with Jack Benny on the Jack Benny Show. He was an absolute genius. And above all else, the best mark of a celebrity is you could communicate with him. And I got on very well. He was interested because apparently I Tore a Puddy Cat was actually at one time #1, I believe, in the UK
Was it
chart.
really?
It was introduced by a disc jockey who may ring a bell, a man called Sam Coster.
Oh, gosh, yes.
Used to be on
Sam
radio
Coster,
too.
absolutely.
Sam P used to be in Much Binding in the Marsh and programs like that. So I said, well, yeah, that's great. Sam Coster was terrific. And I kept in touch with the guy, Mel Blanc, and frequently got little messages from him. And he even did some interviews via satellite, which I used on the radio. So I'm a great fan of Warner Brothers and a real celebrity.
Right.
Great character.
Do you remember Jack Jackson?
Yes, of
Yes.
course.
Well, I mean, it's during the war, just towards the end of the war, before there was a top 10 or anything of that sort, Jack Jackson was a great favourite on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he played a Chinese record, remember?
I do.
Rose, Rose, I love you.
La, da, 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 da,
Da.
Oh my Lord. That was a smash hit.
It was,
Cool,
and
I can't get
I actually was doing a bit of radio in Northern Ireland, and I said just casually, about Jack Jackson and Rose, Rose, I Love You, and some lady phoned up and said, I have got a copy of that record,
Really?
and she brought it over, and for my tenure in Belfast, I used it as a theme tune.
Oh, I am absolutely amazed by that. I know a further story which I shall have to think about, but there was another man, a top writer and travel journalist from Australia, who was a splendid man, and he claimed that he introduced the record to the UK. Now, if we have a little bit of time, I'll sit here and think about that, because I can't quite remember what his name was, and he's no longer with us, needless to say. But he was really interesting. And what an amazing... Do you know, I've been thinking about that record, because you can now obviously pick it up, can't you?
Yes.
I'm sure others will do the same. If they've never heard of it, it's a charm.
Oh, it's charming. But strangely enough, I was looking for something else the other day. And what did I come across? But Rose, Rose, I Love You by Frankie Lane.
Doesn't
There's a
surprise me.
version by Frankie Lane. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Frankie Lane. Here again is what I would call name dropping, because we're going to bounce off each other quite a lot, I suspect. I saw Frankie Lane at the London Palladium. There are two reasons why Frankie Lane rings a bell. One, as a small child, I went to Zandvoort in Holland with a school party in around 1951. And there was a Dodgems there. I mean, this was just after the war, and Zandvoort is not what it is today. And they belted out Jezebel by Frankie Lane. Jezebel!
Yeah.
And that rang a bell as a young schoolboy. And then much, much later, when again working in London, I was going along the Strand, close by the Savoy, and who should I see crossing the road but Frankie Lane? And the point about celebrity is, today you have to be careful how you approach them. Then he was perfectly open, and he signed, and I've got it. Frankie Lane's all.
Yeah, well, yeah, indeed, we have so much in parallel because I got to know Ray Barr, who was his musical director, and as a consequence, I got to meet not only Frankie Lane, but spend quite a bit of time with him. And one of my, I actually. He was in Dublin when I was also in Belfast, and I interviewed him on the phone, and I said, do you remember, Frankie, sitting in a hotel room in Vancouver with you in nothing but your undershorts, listening to whiter shaded pale because you wanted to get the lyrics.
Procol Harum. Procol Harum. Well,
I forget all these things until we start to talk.
well, we better be very careful. This could get out of complete control. And I've just remembered the name of the Australian journalist. So if anybody wants to double check, he was a lovely, lovely man, and his wife, I knew them both. His name was Wilfred Thomas. Wilfred Thomas. And he was of the same breed of someone called Winfried Vaughan Thomas.
Oh, Winfried Vaughan Thomas.
Remember him?
Absolutely.
I mean, again, real broadcasters, real celebrities at a wonderful time. Richard Dimbleby. I remember Richard Dimbleby. I went to the Oval Cricket Ground in South London for what they called, I think it was a variety garden party. And it was raising money for charity just after the war. And the young BBC television man at that time covering it was Richard Dimbleby, so I got his autograph. And there were people like Basil Radford and Norton Wayne, Ivor Novello. I have to say this carefully, that actually I saw Ivor Novello coming out of a gents' toilet, so I got his signature as well. Hermione Badley was another one. Oh my goodness me!
Wonderful day.
Again, celebrities, real celebrities, and that is going to be, I think, a possible theme that we could continue as the weeks go by.
Absolutely. I mean, there are lots of people, and as you say, they're a real celebrity. I think possibly, John, what some people fight is what I would call 2-minute trends. There is such a plethora of people now, and they appear here and they appear there. Here today, goon tomorrow.
Yes,
and,
absolutely. It's like instant, really, and you can't. It isn't instant. It has to take time to create. I mean, you think of the back history to even Mel Blanc, and obviously I mentioned Jack Benny, and before that, recording in the late 1930s, for example, but eventually achieved this massive output as a voiceover above all else.
In those days, there weren't instant celebrities either. I mean, quite often you meet somebody and say, "Oh yeah, I worked at such and such a CBDD in Montana when he was there," and now he's a big star. They really came up the tough way.
Yes, absolutely right. And frankly, I suppose it's easy to say this, but really that is the only way. If you trace comedians even, you've got to remember the days that they were doing the working men's clubs and gigs with about 3 people in the audience. And then ultimately they become Ken Dodd, for example, a good example of that from a very basic.
Yes.
I've learned something very interesting about Ken Dodd within the last 36 hours. Again, others may know this, but they are, no surprises. We've had Eurovision in Liverpool, of course, and the Beatles. That's another whole program about the Beatles and people that I met. But on this occasion, they're celebrating Ken Dodd in Liverpool, and it's a massive exhibition in Liverpool. I think the museum there, I could be wrong. And it's going to be on for at least a couple of years. And of course,
fantastic.
All about Doddy, absolutely.
Yeah.
Ticketing sticks, of course, and that sort of thing. But what a splendid man. And there again, another celebrity who I met on a couple of occasions.
It is also Sunday morning was always sacred, wasn't it? Because that's when a lot of them appeared on radio.
Yes.
And Sunday morning, that nice warmth of I remember and listening to a lot of these characters on wireless.
And then around, I know, talking Sunday, this will ring again a few bells, I'm sure. There was always 2-way family favourites.
Yeah.
With Jean
Metcalf.
Yes, Jean Metcalf, that's right. And didn't she marry the guy at the other end? The fellow used to be on the Today programme. Oh dear, Guy Mitchellmore.
Cliff Mitchellmore. Cliff Mitchellmore.
I think she married him as well. And then of course,
and they say I'm losing my marbles.
It's very good, isn't it? It's amazing these things you do remember. And then following that, of course. Was about, I think, 1:30. It was the Billy Cotton Band show.
Oh, yes. Wakey, wakey.
Oh, my gosh. And his singer was a guy called Alan Breeze, believe it or not. And the remarkable thing about Alan Breeze that a lot of people don't know, and I've even seen Billy Cotton, more about that in a second. Are we all right for time?
Yes.
Are you sure?
Yes. I can tell you exactly. We've been... We've only been 14 minutes. Oh, we got plenty
seems
more
like a
time.
lifetime.
Yes, absolutely.
No, I mean, Billy Cotton was splendid. Alan Breeze had a great difficulty. He stuttered. And it obviously was difficult for him in normal conversation. But whenever he sang songs, you may have heard this before, the stutter completely went.
Yeah.
And on one occasion, he was up for a driving offence in court and appeared personally. And he asked the judge or the magistrate whether he could actually sing his evidence. And apparently he did, and he got off not guilty. He was found not guilty. He actually sang his evidence.
Wonderful.
I saw Billy Cotton at the Grand Theatre in Croydon when they went over to Variety, which was a tough time for Variety. And Billy Cotton was there, and I went on the opening night. And the whole band was on, together with a comedian called Arthur English. Now, there's another name. A lovely ventriloquist called Savine, Daisy May and Savine. And the Billy Cotton Band, and this was the first house, and we'd taken, because we were celebrating the revival of the Grand Theatre, friends of mine took a box on one side of the house and a box on the other side of the house. We were the only people practically in the theatre, which was a bit embarrassing. And unfortunately, Billy Cotton introduced the Dam Busters March. And at this point, a friend of mine called David Rees-Jones, he'd had his RAF Best Blue hat with him. Now, why, I do not know, but he stood in this box throughout the Dam Busters March, played by Billy Cotton, and saluted, which was hilarious. At the end of the Billy Cotton show, they did, I've got a lovely bunch of coconuts. I've got a lovely bunch of coconuts. There they are, standing in a row. Big one, small one, some as big as your head. A flick of the wrist, what the showman said. And then they chucked cotton wool snowballs into the audience, to the audience of about 3. Oh my goodness, enough.
Yes, well, I'll tell you, we want to spend just a little bit of time because one of the focuses of your raison d'etre is the Max Miller. And I think that as this is your first program, and because Max Miller will undoubtedly feature along on several occasions, perhaps there are an awful lot of people out there who are either too young or it's gone by, who don't know who Max Miller is. So why not do a nice introduction, and then we can talk about him week in, week out for a little bit, because it's a fascinating story.
It's a remarkable story, and funnily enough, we related earlier to Ken Dodd, of course, and the Ken Dodds of the world, the Paul Mertons of the world, the Eddie Izzards of the world. They all say Max Miller, number one, the first stand-up comedy man. What stand-up meant was that he didn't use the full stage. By and large, he was front of cloth, curtain very often, or just simple backdrop, and he would just stand there and do comedy to his audience. The one common denominator between Max Miller and, say, Ken Dodd was the gear. In other words, you've got to make an impact, a bit like you do with your hat and scarf. No, you've got to hit them. So first of all, there'll be a signature tune, which with Max Miller was Mary from the Dairy. Dun, 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 dun. But he'd wait. He didn't come on. The orchestra in the pit would strike it up, and people were anticipating. And then he'd come with this amazing hat, wonderful gear, tie, wonderful, what were called correspondent shoes. They're sort of, well, you'd know all about. I don't know what that meant, but he wore them anyway. And he took his hat off, very often took his hat off, and hung it on a hook that you couldn't quite see on the backdrop. And so he hung his hat up there. And they were laughing at this point already. And he only needed one lovely lady, and men and women loved him. All of them loved him. He appealed to men and to women. And he only needed one lady laughing at just his appearance. He would immediately start, "You're right, dear, you know. Now listen, people like you." On one occasion, he did say to someone, he actually said to this woman, could you come with me to other places, please? In other words, suggesting she'd be brilliant to have in the audience. So there's so much to say about Max Miller, but all I can say now is that he was born in 1894. He died in 1963. In other words, 60 years ago this year. He was born in Brighton, he lived in Brighton, and he died in Brighton. And it's a whole new story, and we'll talk about it in time. You know.
Right.
Brilliant.
Well, very briefly, I assume, because I'm not an expert on Max Miller, I assume that he learned his trade in the old music halls.
1000%. Actually, right at the start, in Concert Party in Brighton, where he lived, obviously. He was impoverished family. He used to try and earn a few pennies by being a caddy on the golf course, and he would make a bit of money by retrieving all the golf balls that went missing. And then he'd be flogging them down the market, etc. So it was a wheeler dealer, Jack the lad. The family were poor. They lived in numerous houses in Brighton because they had to move much of the time. I mean, there'd be a family be out the back window. They were that poor. It's alleged that he actually slept under the West Pier on occasions, Max Miller. But he worked for what was called Jack Shepherd's Concert Party, which was midway between the Brighton Palace Pier and the Marina. And that's where the Volks Railway goes these days. And then he would also appear in another concert party along in Hove as well. And he would cycle between the two. And there's a song that we must try and find one of these days, which is called Let's Have a Ride on Your Bicycle. Let's have a ride on your bicycle. And it's a bit rude, actually. I don't think it doesn't actually refer to bicycles. We won't go down there. It was double entendre.
Yeah. But he was actually rude, not obscene.
No, absolutely right.
Yeah.
And again, going back to today's quote unquote comedians, the type of material that we are subjected to all the time, week in and week out. Major shows at the Apollo on television, for example, with a young audience. No one can deny you've got to get an audience, and they all laugh their socks off and they all clap and applaud. So how dare I suggest, that they're not real comedians? Real comedians, well, for example, I don't know, people like Graham Norton. Someone suggested that he was a comedian. I don't think he's a comedian. It's highly questionable. Ken Dodd was a comedian. Roy Hudd was a comedian. Arthur Askey was a comedian. Tommy Hanley was a comedian. Yeah. They were wonderful. By the way, Tommy Hanley, of course, another Liverpool person. Yes. Liverpool created all this.
Itmar, Tommy Hanley.
Oh, Tommy Hanley, of course. And that was, I've got a whole number, I'll bring them next time maybe. I've got a whole series of books about Itmar, which was lovely. Tommy Hanley. Yeah. And all the catchphrases.
Colonel Chinstrap.
I don't mind if I do.
Mrs. Malatrop.
Can I do you now, sir? That's another one. And there was Moan a lot as well.
Yeah, that's right.
It's being so cheerful that keeps me going, which I think sort of sums up everything.
But actually, that precedes the era that we're really talking about, is because Itmar, Tommy Hanley, kept people going throughout the war.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that reference to Itmar was actually a slight reference to Adolf Hitler. When people say, is that man again? Because he was always on the news, and they resented it. So along comes Tommy Hanley with all the characters. And most of that early series from Tommy Hanley was actually in Cardiff, funnily enough, because the BBC moved entertainment lock, stock and barrel out of London with all the Blitz going on. Mind you, the Blitz didn't stop Max Miller. Max Miller was at the London Palladium in 1940 at the height of the Blitz with Dame Vera Lynn in a thing called Apple Crush. I think it was Apple Crush or Apple Sauce. Apple Sauce. And that was with bombs hailing down East and West London. And there they were in a major theatre entertaining people. And finally, Max Miller entertained the troops in 1940, the same year, here in Lewes at what was the Deluxe Cinema.
Yay.
But it wasn't deluxe. Known locally
as Fleabag. Yes.
That's it. So much more to talk about next time.
Indeed. We have actually just about filled a half an hour non-stop. And you learn all sorts of things about people, don't you? What I didn't know is that you and I both work for the same airline.
Good Lord. Well, the more this conversation goes on, the long may it do so. By the way, this is just to say these are two what should we call ourselves? I don't know, two old toughs. But we we're interested to hear from other people. So if anybody wants to contact us, that would be absolutely terrific. If we've rung any bells today, try and get in touch with us. I'm sure you can tell people what to do.
Absolutely. If you go on to miradortelevision.com, you should be able to leave a message there, or even when we're on the air, you can leave a message. Also, we encourage people to simply drop by.
Yep.
If you're in the Lewes area, drop by and come and sit and chat to us for 5 or 10 minutes.
Absolutely.
Because we'd love to see your face and love to get your experiences.
It's a good idea.
And,
it's going on out there now, isn't it? That's the whole point.
It's here in this studio, you are the celebrity, not us.
Absolutely right. So, want to be a celebrity? Like Tweety Pie? Oh, I wish he would sing though. It's very annoying. I think it needs batteries, like we both do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a wonderful half hour, John, and we shall look forward to seeing you this time next week.
100%.
And we'll go some more, and we'll do a little bit more detail of some of the things that we talked about this morning, because it was a golden era, and things from the past is. Our program here is modelled on something called Pebble Mill at 1, which many people do remember.
Yep.
And the whole idea of Pebble Mill at 1 is that people could wander through the set and wave at the celebrities and so on and so forth on their way to work, or on the way to check in, or even on the way to say, I want to see so-and-so. And if you come into this hotel, you are more than welcome to wander through the set. And come and meet the whatever we call ourselves, the old somethings, and contribute to the program, because I think that it's in Yorkshire, they say there's not as daft as people. We're as daft as you'll get. So come and join us. Until tomorrow, this is Keith Hayes with John Henty, a great new member of the team. And we're about to sign off. Say we'll see you tomorrow. And it's our favourite sign off. Toodle doodle pip.
Thank you.